Even now, years later, Annie can still feel a chill when she thinks about that family camping trip deep in the Colorado wilderness. Each summer they'd pack up and head out to San Isabel National Forest, an isolated, quiet spot where the family could hike, fish, and get away from the bustle of daily life. It was only a couple of hours from town, but it might as well have been a different world, silent, vast, and empty. The journey to their usual campsite was a familiar routine. The road out of town would wind into a dense forest, narrowing into an uneven dirt path flanked by towering pines. Once they reached this point, the forest seemed to consume everything. No cell service, no other people, and no sign of civilization. Just the trees stretching up toward the sky like silent sentinels. The morning of that particular trip started out like any other. Annie and her younger brother Mark awoke at dawn, the first rays of light barely breaking through the canopy. They had been looking forward to their early morning fishing trip, hoping to reach the lake before anyone else stirred. The lake was their favorite spot, tucked behind a rusty old gate that barred the original road leading deeper into the forest. It was a forgotten place, and that's what made it perfect. As they approached the gate, Annie's footsteps slowed. Parked right in front of it was an old, dusty car, a worn-down gray sedan streaked with dirt and patches of rust. It seemed strange, wrong even. There were no other campsites nearby, and no other cars had been on the road. The sight of that car, sitting silently and alone, brought a sinking feeling to Annie's stomach. Inside the car, she saw two people, a man and a woman, both of whom looked as out of place as the car itself. The man was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at them with an odd, frozen smile, his face partially shadowed. His graying hair was disheveled, and his eyes, though friendly at first glance, seemed to hold something unsettling, a gleam that was almost too focused, too intense. Beside him, a woman with jet black hair sat in silence, her skin deathly pale and her gaze fixed straight ahead. She didn't smile. She didn't move. The man leaned out of the window, his voice carrying an overly cheerful tone. "Good morning, kids," he called out. Annie hesitated, glancing at Mark, who looked as nervous as she felt. Reluctantly, she managed a small, cautious wave. "Good morning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are you headed?" the man asked, his smile never wavering. Annie told him they were going to the lake to fish, and that their parents were just a short distance back at camp. She didn't know why she felt the need to add that last part. Maybe it was some instinctive need to remind the stranger that they weren't alone out here. The woman, who had been completely silent, finally spoke, her voice soft yet cold. "Be careful, kids. The path to the lake is long, and it's easy to get lost." There was something strange in her tone, almost as if she were enjoying the thought of them getting lost. Annie gave a small, forced nod, turning away as fast as she could, but before they could leave, the man spoke again. "Is that your little brother with you?" His smile had twisted into something unnatural, almost predatory. Annie felt her skin prickle as she nodded, not daring to meet his gaze. "Take care of each other," he added, his voice light but his words somehow unsettling. Both he and the woman then stared at them with expressions that Annie couldn't decipher. But something in those looks left a cold dread in her stomach. Their faces were frozen, their smiles a little too wide, their eyes following her and Mark even as they began to walk away. They moved as quickly as they could, their footsteps crunching on the gravel, and neither of them spoke until they were well out of sight. Only when the silence of the forest enveloped them again did Annie feel her heartbeat start to settle. The lake appeared up ahead, calm and serene, and they tried to shake off the strange encounter, casting their lines into the water and focusing on the rhythmic ripples. The sun began to climb higher, casting dappled light over the lake, and for a while, the morning felt peaceful again. But every so often, Annie would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see that gray sedan or hear the voice of that unsettling man calling after them. A couple of hours passed, and just as Annie started to relax, Mark wandered over to a shaded area of rocks by the water's edge. "Annie?" he called out, his voice wavering with something like fear. She hurried over and saw what he was pointing at, a dark, dried stain on one of the stones, unmistakably blood. Annie felt a prickling unease return, stronger than before. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had gutted a fish here, and the stain was just left over from that. But something didn't sit right. The blood looked as if it had been there a while, dried and darkened, as though no one had been near this spot in days. Just then, Mark's eyes widened and he gestured out toward the water. Annie turned to see a pair of dress shoes, dark and heavy, drifting aimlessly near the shore. One of them was tipped sideways, and as it floated closer, she noticed what looked like a small blood stain on the inside of one shoe. A shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't help but think of the man and woman in the car. Were these their shoes? And if so, why were they here? She grabbed Mark's arm, whispering, "We need to leave. Now." They packed up in a rush, the eerie silence of the forest pressing down on them as they climbed the steep path back to the campsite. Annie kept glancing over her shoulder, feeling as though someone or something might be following. Each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves set her nerves on edge, and the closer they got to the top of the trail, the faster her heart pounded. When they finally reached the top, her relief was short-lived. The sedan was still there, but the car was empty, and an eerie stillness hung over the clearing. Just as they let out a sigh of relief, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the quiet, coming from somewhere in the trees. Annie turned slowly, her stomach dropping. The man was standing there, just beyond the tree line, barefoot and smiling in that same strange way. His clothes were wrinkled, his expression frozen, as if he hadn't moved since they'd first seen him. "Catch any fish?" he called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge. Then, from somewhere out of sight, the woman's voice chimed in, soft and chilling. "Did you enjoy the lake?" Without waiting for her brother to respond, Annie grabbed his hand, her voice low and urgent. "Run." They sprinted back to the campsite, their breath coming in gasps, their eyes wide with terror. When they finally burst into the camp, they told their parents everything. Their father grabbed his flashlight, determined to confront the strangers. But when he reached the trailhead, the car was gone. No tire tracks, no sign of anyone, just the forest and its overwhelming silence. For the rest of her life, Annie would be haunted by that day. She couldn't forget the hollow look in the man's eyes, the woman's cold smile, or the shoes drifting by the lake with their faint stain of blood. She still didn't know who those strangers were, or if they were even real. But every now and then when she's alone in the quiet woods, she can still hear the echo of that voice, playful and mocking, drifting through the trees. "Did you catch any fish?" It was late last summer when Ben, a high school senior at 17, joined his father, Tom, for their annual camping trip. They had found a new site to explore deep within the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. The online map promised a quiet and secluded spot far from the busier trails, a perfect choice for their tradition. When they pulled onto the gravel shoulder early that Saturday morning, they found the trail shrouded in thick fog, the trees standing tall and silent, almost as if guarding the entrance to another world. The air was damp and heavy, filling Ben's lungs with a chill as they stepped out of the car. The trail quickly proved more challenging than expected. Instead of the easy walk promised online, they found themselves trudging through mud, dodging low-hanging branches, and slipping on moss-covered rocks. Dense brambles clawed at their clothes, leaving faint scratches on Ben's arms. The path wound deeper and deeper into the forest, and soon the morning light could barely penetrate the thick canopy above. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional snap of twigs beneath their boots. Every now and then, a crow cawed from somewhere unseen, its call echoing through the eerie silence, but otherwise, the forest was still. Too still. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, they reached a small clearing where they could set up their tent. It was a simple patch of grass, ringed by trees that stood taller and denser than any they had seen on their way in. Ben looked around, feeling an odd sense of unease settle over him. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so, as if it were holding its breath, watching, waiting. They pitched the tent and sat down for a quick lunch, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had been creeping up on them. Tom, always the talker, tried to fill the silence with stories from his own youth, tales of other camping trips he had taken as a young man. But Ben noticed that even his father's voice sounded different, quieter, as though he didn't want to disturb the forest's slumber. As the afternoon wore on, they decided to gather firewood, venturing into the surrounding woods to collect branches. They moved quietly, not daring to stray too far from each other, though neither said it out loud. And then, just as they were chatting about some old memory, a sharp, agonized scream tore through the forest. The sound was raw, filled with fear and desperation, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Ben froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at his father, whose face had turned pale. Tom was silent, listening, his head cocked slightly as though trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. They scanned the trees, eyes wide, but all they could see was an endless wall of trunks and shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scream stopped, leaving only a heavy, oppressive silence in its wake. Did you hear that?" Ben whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. Tom nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, it sounded close." They stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sign of life. Then the scream came again, even closer this time. It was deeper, rougher, like someone or something was clawing its way through the underbrush. The noise scraped against Ben's nerves, making the hairs on his neck stand up. The scream was unlike anything he'd ever heard, more animalistic than human, yet filled with a raw terror that chilled him to the bone. Tom glanced at Ben, his face hard, calculating. "Stay by the fire, Ben. I'll go check it out," he said, his voice low and controlled. Ben wanted to protest, but the look on his father's face silenced him. He watched as Tom disappeared into the trees, his figure swallowed almost immediately by the shadows. Alone now, Ben tried to calm his racing heart, but the silence only grew heavier, pressing down on him. He sat by the fire, staring into the woods, every nerve on edge. The sky had begun to darken, and the light filtering through the canopy was fading, turning the forest into a vast expanse of shadows and indistinct shapes. Time seemed to stretch, each minute feeling like an hour. Ben could hear every rustle of leaves, every crack of a distant branch, his mind racing with possibilities of what might be out there. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the screaming stopped. Silence filled the forest once again, so complete that Ben could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. His father had been gone too long. Fear gnawed at his insides, twisting his stomach into knots. He stood, pacing around the fire, glancing anxiously in the direction his father had disappeared. Just as he was about to call out, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving slowly through the underbrush. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by unease. The footsteps were coming from the opposite direction of where his father had gone. Ben held his breath, listening intently. And then, from deep within the trees, he heard his father's voice calling his name. Ben. It was calm, too calm, each syllable drawn out slowly, almost as if it were a whisper carried by the wind. A strange dread settled over him. Something was wrong. He took a step toward the voice but stopped himself. The footsteps were still coming closer, crunching through the undergrowth. And then he saw movement between the trees, a shadow, shifting and swaying, just at the edge of his vision. He called out, his voice breaking the silence. "Dad?" But the voice came again, from the same direction as before, closer now, still low and even. "Ben, come here." His instinct told him to stay put. He backed away slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, every muscle tense. The footsteps grew louder, each step deliberate, almost as if something was mimicking the sound of human steps, drawing closer and closer. Just as he was about to turn and run, his father burst out from the opposite side of the clearing, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a fear Ben had never seen before. "Ben, get back to camp. Now," he ordered, his voice shaking. Ben didn't argue. They grabbed what little they could and set off, half jogging back toward the trail. As they moved, his father kept glancing over his shoulder, his face tight, his hands clenched. They didn't speak. Their breath labored as they stumbled through the trees, every shadow and sound heightening their panic. The forest had grown darker, and the way back felt infinitely longer than the hike in. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent shivers down Ben's spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The oppressive silence of the forest seemed to deepen, as though the trees themselves were closing in on them, pushing them out. When they finally reached the car, they threw their gear into the trunk, climbed in, and sped off, leaving the campsite, and whatever had been lurking there, far behind. For the entire drive back, neither of them spoke. Ben watched his father, whose knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his face a mask of terror and resolve. In the days that followed, Ben tried to ask his father about what he'd seen. But every time, Tom would go quiet, his eyes distant, as though he were still in that forest, haunted by something he couldn't or wouldn't explain. Even now, the memory lingers. In the quiet moments before sleep, Ben can still hear that scream, raw and desperate, echoing from the depths of Ozark. He can still feel the dread that settled in his chest that night, the sense that they had encountered something ancient and unknowable, something that lurks in the shadows, waiting, watching. And whenever he closes his eyes, he can still hear his father's voice, soft and chilling, calling his name through the darkness. Or at least, something that sounded like his father. Last fall, Aaron, an experienced hiker in his late 20s, set off on a solo backpacking trip into the remote depths of the Siskiyou Wilderness in Northern California. He had hiked many trails before, but this time was different. He wanted solitude, and the Siskiyou offered just that. Miles of untouched wilderness, where even seasoned hikers rarely ventured. With 15 miles of dense forest separating him from the nearest road, he felt completely alone, yet not quite at ease. The silence here felt heavier, more intense, almost as if the forest were aware of his presence. The first 2 days went by uneventfully. The early autumn chill hung in the air, bringing with it an otherworldly quiet that seemed to muffle his every step. As he pushed deeper into the forest, the landscape grew darker and denser. Leaves blazed in shades of crimson and gold, casting an ethereal glow in the daylight. But at dusk, the trees turned to shadows, looming and watchful. On the morning of the third day, after brewing a quick cup of coffee on his camp stove, Aaron set out toward his next campsite, about 5 miles further into the wilderness. The trail twisted through thick underbrush, and even with the sun climbing higher, shadows clung to the forest floor. Each step seemed to echo, amplified in the unnatural stillness. No birds chirped, no squirrels rustled. It was as if the entire forest were holding its breath. 4 hours into his hike, Aaron's solitude was shattered by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. He froze, listening as the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs grew louder, coming steadily closer. Out of the dim forest shadows emerged a man, walking in Aaron's direction with his head slightly lowered, his pace slow and deliberate. As they drew closer, Aaron noticed something off about the man. He was wearing only a thin, long-sleeved shirt and faded pants. No jacket, no backpack, not even a water bottle. It was as if he had simply wandered into the wilderness, unprepared and unaffected by the cold. Aaron forced a polite nod as they passed, and the man returned the gesture. But there was something strange in his eyes. A blankness, a hollow stare that seemed to look through Aaron rather than at him. Feeling unsettled, Aaron quickened his pace, casting a glance over his shoulder once he thought he was far enough away. To his surprise, the man had stopped on the trail, standing perfectly still, staring at him. Aaron's heart skipped a beat. He turned back and kept walking, telling himself he was just imagining things, that maybe the man was just a fellow hiker taking a break. But the encounter left a strange chill running down his spine, and the silence around him suddenly felt more oppressive, more sinister. After another hour, he reached his designated campsite. A small clearing nestled in a ring of towering pines, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The campsite felt secluded, isolated from the rest of the world, with no clear views beyond the wall of trees. Aaron set up his tent quickly, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him from just beyond the tree line. The thought made him uneasy, so he tried to brush it off, chalking it up to nerves. As dusk settled, Aaron sat outside his tent, watching the last rays of light fade through the trees. The silence was absolute, like the forest itself was waiting for something. The faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch were the only sounds, each one sending a prickle of anxiety through him. Just as he was starting to relax, a noise behind him shattered the stillness. A soft shuffling came from the shadows at the edge of the campsite. Aaron whipped around, his pulse quickening. Standing just within the shadows was the same man he had passed on the trail. He hadn't changed clothes or added any layers, despite the evening chill that had begun to settle over the forest. His face was partially hidden in shadow, but his eyes caught the dim light, staring fixedly at Aaron. Can I help you?" Aaron called out, his voice coming out shaky. The man didn't answer. He stood as still as a statue, his eyes wide, unblinking, almost as if he were seeing something beyond Aaron. Seconds passed, then a minute. The longer the man stood there unmoving, the more surreal the situation became, like something out of a fevered nightmare. Aaron's skin prickled with cold dread. He wanted to move, to run, but his legs felt frozen, locked in place by some primal fear. At last, the man's gaze shifted, his eyes meeting Aaron's, and a twisted, unsettling smile spread across his face. Without a word, he turned and slipped back into the darkness of the forest, vanishing almost as quickly as he had appeared. For a long time, Aaron sat there, paralyzed by fear, his mind racing. Why had the man followed him? How had he found him in such an isolated part of the forest? And that smile, there was something deeply wrong in it, something that chilled Aaron to his core. As night fell, Aaron retreated into his tent, trying to block out the haunting image of the stranger. He lay in the dark, clutching his small hunting knife, every muscle tense. Outside, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds he hadn't noticed before. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and every noise seemed louder, closer, like footsteps creeping ever closer to his tent. Then, in the dead of night, he heard it, the soft, deliberate crunch of leaves just outside. His heart raced as he held his breath, listening as the footsteps circled his tent slowly, each step deliberate, unhurried, almost like a predator toying with its prey. His hand gripped the knife tighter, his knuckles white. The footsteps paused right beside his head, and he could see a faint shadow through the tent fabric, cast by the moonlight. He lay there, frozen in terror, hoping whoever, or whatever it was, would leave. But the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, as if in answer to his silent prayers, the footsteps receded, fading back into the forest. Aaron didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat in his tent, eyes wide open, straining to hear any sign of movement. Every crackle, every faint sound seemed amplified, as though the forest itself were conspiring against him. When dawn finally broke, he felt a surge of relief, but his nerves were frayed. He packed up quickly, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes, half expecting the stranger to reappear. As he finally hiked back to the main trail, he thought he was safe. But just as he neared the road, he stopped, a chill running down his spine. Standing at the edge of the forest, hidden in the shadow of the trees, was the man. He stood perfectly still, watching Aaron with that same vacant stare, his mouth twisted in that same unnerving smile. Aaron didn't hesitate. He rushed to his car, heart pounding, and drove off without looking back. But the memory lingered. The hollow eyes, the unnatural smile, the way the man had moved through the forest like a shadow. In the weeks that followed, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even when he was safe at home. At night, he would sometimes wake up, heart pounding, sure he'd heard footsteps outside his window, or catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure standing just beyond his yard. Even now, the image of the man in the siskiyou haunts him. A dark figure in his nightmares, lurking just out of sight, always waiting, watching with those empty eyes and that twisted smile. He no longer hikes alone, and sometimes late at night he wonders if the man, or whatever he was, is still out there, roaming the forest, waiting for his next visitor.